to show. We have to show what.
You're worth something. You're worth everything to God. Yes, yes.
Just exactly what you were saying.
You can't take credit for this. It is a gift from God, for we are God's masterpiece. He has created us in you in Christ Jesus so we can do the
So
good
I know
things
you all.
in
I
others.
mean, but
You are His
there's-
masterpiece. His one-of-a-kind work of art. They're all damaged masterpieces in need of restoration. I like the image of the masterpiece. It's really nice, and the restoration.
He's saying that people with this is all about near-death experience, and when people report, he's saying they're coming back with a much clearer image of this concept than
Isn't
we
that
have.
something?
Really? Now
What
what's
God has
that?
done for you.
It's called Imagining Heaven. Somebody gave me that for my grieving. My grieving. My
Near-death
grieving.
experience, get a clear message. God has a purpose for you still. See,
Isn't that
Oh,
cool?
that is so cool.
And his sermon was that last week. So, and then I'm.
Yes, yes.
But I like the idea of the masterpiece and being sort of an unfinished masterpiece that needs to be restored. So again, that's a good. I'm an image person. I like images and stories. So.
Oh, me too. I'm a visual.
Oh, I'm very visual. So if I can't figure it out, you draw me a picture or give me an image, and then all of a sudden I get it. That's why I like that
Just
Jesus
remind
taught
me.
parables. I would have understood. I would have been like, oh, I understand what you're trying to do because you're doing parables. And I understand stories.
They hook sound to under his with a
And two of you in the front here, huh?
You have to have the two old hecklers from, what is it, Kermit the Frog or something?
Oh yeah, you're all two old men up in the. No, you're supposed to be sitting up there. Hey, Gary.
You've got a great crowd for a hurricane night.
Yeah, really. I know, isn't this color good?
I do like that color, yeah.
Pastor Mark even said that today. I didn't like that at first, but he goes, I think I like it. And I ran somebody else with it today, and I said, you got good taste.
Yeah, that's nice. We'll be careful.
You're going to do what?
We're going to critique you.
He'll critique you
There's
all.
not much to critique on tonight. Tonight's like the opening class. How would you take the opening class and get the syllabus and let's go home. Tonight's kind of a flat night. The meeting starts next week. I'd say about it's probably going to be a good idea because we'll be referring to passages, but we're not going to get into the books actually until after Christmas. We're actually going to be spending between now and Christmas just doing the background.
You can use it. I have two people lined up after.
I think that
6 weeks of background.
if anybody has to critique you, I think you ought to give them a grade at the end of the class too.
You didn't hear my sermon yesterday, did you?
I did.
Well, everybody gets an A.
Yeah. I
It was excellent.
yeah, I listened to it a lot. We weren't here, you know, and so I heard Saturdays.
Oh, okay.
And then I thought, well, I was right there, so I thought I'm just going to go on this Sunday. So I heard it, and I was a little surprised. Different pastor, so it caught me by surprise. I was expecting
Ronnie did Saturday, and then
Yeah.
he did like here.
Yeah.
And so this week, Pastor Mark was doing here, and then Saturday here. Like
Because it was so close to what he was talking about.
Well, and I did. I critiqued it. I even sent. I sent Pastor Mark a note on it.
Okay.
And on all of it, it was
No wonder he told me today he wanted to see me. We got to talk. There they are. How does it feel to come at the last minute?
I stole that out of your office.
Oh, did you? I didn't know I had that in my office. So you're gonna be here Saturday night?
Yeah.
Preaching Saturday night. If you're here, I'd like you to
Okay.
preside.
Nobody's.
Well, that's why I was gonna check with you. If you weren't here tonight, I was gonna text you.
Oh, great. I do both.
Okay, good.
Wherever you want.
Before Bruce gets started, there's a couple of you here tonight that I haven't seen at class before. Most of you may know or may not know, we live stream the classes nowadays, and we record them to DVD, and they're archived on the web page. So if you need to ask a question, you need to raise your hand so I can bring you the microphone. Because without the microphone, the people that might be watching somewhere else cannot hear the question. We don't show your face on the camera, only your voice.
Unless you want it.
Even if you want, we don't.
Well, no, we can bring them up front and then.
We're here. Did you hold the whole class up for us?
Just for you all. I wanted to see what the weather is doing. The sun looks like it's out right now. The official time is on the computer. When that computer says 6 o'clock, it's 6 o'clock. That's the official clock right there. It's 5:59. Because computers know more than we do anyway, so I want to compare it to this one. Okay, our official clock says 6 o'clock, which is not this clock right here. The official clock is the computer, because computers are never wrong. So if the computer says 6 o'clock, it must be 6 o'clock. Let's pause for just a moment and start with a word of prayer. Lord God, Heavenly Father, we bless you and we thank you for the many gifts that you give us, the gift of this day, the gift of our lives, the gift of our faith. And this evening, especially as we start a new class, we praise you and thank you for the gift of our minds. We thank you that you have created us and made us inquisitive, to ask questions, to search for meaning. And we're thankful that we can try to make sense of things and through that become closer to you. Lord, help us to grow in love with each other and with you. Open our minds and our hearts to your word as we study one of the great apostles of our faith. As we listen to his words, as we hear about his background, may it strengthen us in courage and in love so that we may be better your disciples on earth. And as always, we pray in Jesus' name. Amen. Okay, anybody new to Hope University? Anybody here for the first time? That's very good. Welcome to those of you who are here for the first time. We have a lot of pride in Hope University. I'd like to recognize Pastor Dean, who has put in so many years of work in this. If you were here in September, you know that he took the month of September. I want to publicly thank him for all that he does. So, I also want to let you know that as we go through the rest of the semester between now and Christmas, that I'll be going in October, and then Dean will be coming back in November to start us looking at the Gospel of Matthew, which is going to be what we're going to be looking at in the narrative lectionary this year. And then we'll be coming back in December. And as I've looked at the number, we only have 3 classes in October and 3 in December. And the reason we only have 3 in October is because when Pastor Ronnie is installed on October 23rd, that's a Tuesday night. And so instead of, telling them to rush through the installation as quickly as possible so that we can get up here, we just thought it best to cancel it. And if we're going to cancel it on Tuesday night, we're also going to cancel it on Wednesday morning, because we really do want to keep the Tuesday evening and the Wednesday morning being the same so that people can come to either one and you won't miss anything in that way. Okay, how many of you also know that this is being live streamed? okay, and is also available on the internet. So Al talked about that just a minute ago. He emphasized that if you have a question that you'll need the microphone so that your voice will show up on that. That's a good way, especially if you can't be here. You don't have to be here every week for what we're going to do. I mean, you'll miss some things. I'll try to keep some outlines available if you do miss a week and you want to come the next week. But it's not like if you miss one, you won't be able to pick up the next week. So this isn't going to be like a serial television show, you know, where you miss that one episode and then you watch it the next week and there are all these characters and you have no idea who they are. It's not going to be like that. Each week is going to be kind of a standalone between now and Christmas. And then after Christmas is when we're going to start looking at the actual letters of Paul. Okay, and right now what we're planning on doing it, because Pastor Ronnie wanted to also be involved, and so what he would like to do, and again, we still have to meet as a committee to kind of talk about this, but as we go through the letters, we might look at kind of a study in here and then move it to more of a Bible study or a prayerful approach to it the next week. And so we might be taking 2 weeks on each letter. So we'll let you know more information as we get closer to that. Okay? So this is a study of Paul. We're going to start slow, okay? So tonight I'm going to be looking at an introduction, basically, which isn't as long as what we're going to be doing for the next several weeks. And so I'm going to supplement that with a couple of other things tonight. I was going to try to do this session and next week's session and cram it in, but I thought, you know, that's going to be really tight on time. I personally would rather there be extra time left. I've been a teacher, and I've taught at the college level. Students don't usually mind it if class ends early. But they do when class goes late because I look and I see things like this, you know. So what I want to start with first of all is because this is the first time that you have had me as a teacher. So I just want to spend a little bit of time telling you about me, especially about me as regards to teaching, just so that you have a little bit of sense of it. I don't have a doctorate. I was not a seminary professor, but I am a teacher, and I'm very proudly a teacher. I grew up Catholic, as many of you know. I went to Catholic schools. I was extremely lucky to go to a all-boy Catholic high school in Louisville, Kentucky, St. Xavier High School, which is like one of the top 60 schools in the country. So I'm a firm believer if you get a good education, especially at an early age, that really benefits you for the rest of your life. And I certainly felt like it did that for me. So I went, after high school, I felt that I was perhaps called to the ministry, but I wanted to double check that. So I actually went to Purdue University where I had a scholarship for pre-med for 1 year. After one semester, you know, back then with pre-med you had to have all A's. At the end of one semester I had all A's and 1 B. And I thought that was pretty good, but my counselor called me in and said, "What do you want to change your major to?" And I said, "Well, I really don't want to change my major." "No, you're going to have to change your major. What do you want to change it to?" So I really kind of took that as a sign that maybe I was in the wrong place. I stayed for the second semester. I think I was a biology major at that time, but I started looking in the seminary. I left after my freshman year of college and went to St. Meinrad Seminary, which is a Benedictine monastery located in southern Indiana. Now, they had a high school there at one time, they had a college, and they had a graduate school, all located in the middle of a cornfield in southern Indiana, where the nearest McDonald's is 32 miles away. I can tell you because we went there often and we had to find somebody who had a car to take us there. As I said, it was a Benedictine monastery run by Benedictine monks. I learned from some wonderful, wonderful teachers there. I went to college there. I finished in 3 years, and I finished with a Bachelor of Arts in Philosophy and a minor in Mathematics. And at the time, the diocese said to me, "We don't want you to stay where you are. We want you to move somewhere else." So we looked at all kinds of schools. We went up to St. John's, Minnesota. Anybody from Minnesota? Okay, we went up to, that was one of the places we looked at. Beautiful. We went there in the middle of the summer. It was gorgeous. I loved the campus. I loved the professors I met. I loved the students. And I thought, you know, this might really work. And then they said, "Oh, by the way, we need to show you the best feature of this school." And the best feature of the school was the tunnel system that connected all the buildings. And I said, "Well, why do you have tunnels that connect all the buildings?" And they said, "Well, there are times of the year where that's the only way you can get between the buildings." So much for that. We looked at Notre Dame, but we were there in the winter, And the snow was so deep in South Bend you couldn't even see when you came up to a traffic stop how to turn. I loved it. My vocation director did not. They didn't have classes on Friday. I really liked that. Their seminary was actually a house of studies at Notre Dame campus. You attended your classes at Notre Dame. I thought, wouldn't that be great? I would love to be going to graduate school at Notre Dame, but I was voted down by my vocation director. Ended up going to graduate school for 1 year at St. Mary's Seminary in Baltimore, Maryland, on Roland Park, if anyone is familiar with Baltimore. Loved the school. I began to work on a Master of Sacred Theology at that time, which is a little bit more of an academic degree than a Master of Divinity. But my mom's health was getting bad at that time. She had some esophagus issues, and I had to make 2 trips back home during that year. And so basically decided I should go back to St. Meinrad where I was. That was only an hour and a half away from home. Transferred back to St. Meinrad. In 1982, I got a Master of Divinity and was ordained a Catholic priest for the Archdiocese of Louisville. I served in the Archdiocese for 4 years, from 1982 to 1986. And when I was there, I spent 3 years at a parish that had 1,200 families in a K through 8 grade school. And I spent 1 year at a parish that had 1,000 families with a K through 8 grade school. I also was chaplain of an all-girl Catholic high school. And my favorite thing that I did, I loved parish ministry, absolutely loved everything that I did, but I loved to teach. And any opportunities, Anita can tell you, because she was at my second assignment. She was an 8th grade teacher, and I worked with her with confirmation, worked with parents, worked at the high school where I was, and any opportunity I had to teach was great. When I decided to leave ministry, I wanted to become a teacher. And so I already had a minors in math. I went back and turned it into a major and took all the education courses, and then I was ready to teach. I wanted to teach high school. And at that time, people said, oh, you want to teach math and you're a man, you won't have any problem at all. There were no positions at all. Could not find a teaching position anywhere. Anita said, you're going to get a job. I don't care what it is, you're going to get a job. You're not just going to sit around and wait for somebody to call you. So we were not yet married at the time, but I already knew how to say yes, dear. And so I went down to the bulletin board to kind of get an idea what opportunities there were. And I said, okay, math. I'm a math person. Math. Oh, the IRS is hiring. Well, that's accounting, right? That's math. So I ended up actually getting hired by the IRS. I worked for the IRS for 8 years. I know. Look at those faces. So I went. Imagine when you go to a party and say, I used to be a priest and now I work for the IRS. Talk about some real conversation, or conversation stopper. But I was a tax auditor. I ended up working my way up to the director's staff, where I was just public affairs officer. I did all TV appearances and all of that, until eventually our district was collapsed into the national district and we all lost our jobs. Now, if you've worked for the federal government, you lose your job, but you really don't lose your job. You're just kind of sitting around waiting for the next opportunity. So after playing solitaire for a month or two, I saw that there was a detail to teach at a historically black college and university, Kentucky State University. And it was a 2-year detail, and I went there and taught tax and accounting, and absolutely loved it. And even there at the school, the dean of the school said, I wish you had a doctorate. I would take you as a teacher right now. The students love you. Everybody loves what you do. You love what you're doing. But my 2 years was up, and I had to go back and start playing solitaire again. Did that for another 2 or 3 months, and then finally decided I just had to leave. I just could not sit there and not do anything. So I went into public accounting. Worked first for a small firm that was located in southern Indiana, actually. Worked for them for a couple years until Arthur Andersen hired me away from them. And I went and worked at Arthur Andersen, which was one of the big 5 at the time. Got my CPA. 1996, I sat for the CPA exam, and I passed it on the first time with the highest score in the state of Kentucky in 1996. When anybody knows the CPA exam, they know it's really a big deal to even pass it. It's no longer active. I kept it active for a number of years until I finally realized I'm really not going to do that. That's not what my love is. So while I was at Arthur Andersen, kind of interesting, they had me do a few little training classes around there, and they said, you know what? You're a teacher. You should be teaching. Well, they had a national facility located in St. Charles, Illinois. Is it? Yep. Real near Chicago. Anita can tell you because I would be up there in December and she would come up and we'd spend the weekend in Chicago doing Christmas shopping on Michigan Avenue. And I'd go back. And so I was spending about a week a month up at St. Charles teaching. And then I'd have to go back and sit at a computer until 2 o'clock in the morning working on tax returns or audits or things like that. And I finally realized that that 1 week was so much more enjoyable than the 3 weeks of sitting there at the computer. And so I told Anita that I wanted to teach. And she said, well, you know how much less money you're going to be making than you're making now? And I said, I do, but I really do want to teach. That's what I want to do. I want to teach. I've wanted this from the very beginning. That's exactly what I want to do. And so I applied, and this time I was hired. Now, it took a while. The call didn't come till late in the summer. And the first call I got was from an alternative school, which was a school for all girls who are one step away from going to jail, basically. I mean, we were talking about some very special needs children here, and it was grades 6 through 12. Anita said, you're taking the first job, the first one that calls, that's the one you're going to take. And I said, this is the first call, so okay, I'm on board, I'll do it. I said, well, this isn't what I really had in mind as far as teaching goes. I really was kind of picturing, you know, a traditional high school, you know, kind of, you know, remember how high school was, you know, you sat there and pep rallies and football games, and yeah, we didn't have that. But it was a great 2 years. It was a wonderful 2 years. And I think it was those 2 years that I realized that it's more than just teaching, that's where ministry. I mean, it really was a ministry that was going on there. And I mean, literally in one classroom, I'd have a 6th grader, and I had a senior taking calculus in the same class and trying to teach all of I had about 8 to 10 students in a class. It was very highly stressful because they were very needy. They would go off. You had to call people for help and all that going on constantly. But I had these girls using graphing calculators, printing out things. We were putting it on the wall outside. The superintendent came and he couldn't believe the thing that these girls that had these unbelievable needs, what they were able to do. So it was very fulfilling, but Anita was at Male High School, which is one of the top high schools in the state located in Louisville, and that's really where I wanted to be so that we could be there together. So I went there and spent, I think, 16 years there. Eventually was teaching calculus and pre-calculus when I retired in 2016. So that was full-time teaching. While I was teaching there, I was also teaching 2 nights a week at a school called Jefferson County High School, which was a school for at-risk students. So I was there for them from 6 to 9, 2 nights a week. I got National Board certified, and I was mentoring candidates for National Board certification each year, and I was training other mentors on weekends. So it was nonstop. So I was really looking forward to retiring to the villages and just taking it easy and playing golf. And yeah, and that things changed a little. They're a little different than what I was anticipating it to be. But I mean, I did come here, and that's what I did. Worked at the golf course for a while until Pastor Mark asked me to help out here, and we'll save that for another time. Okay, that's an interesting story what the last year has held. But what I wanted to do tonight was, I just wanted to let you see my background as a teacher. Okay, and that is really what my love is. And so when Pastor Mark told me that Pastor Dean was looking for somebody to share this program to eventually be able to hand it over, I said, well, education is what I love the most. I love education. And so it seemed like a great opportunity to be able to do it. And I'm so thankful because Dean, we met this past week, and he wants to be involved in this next semester and beyond. And I am beyond excited about that because I hope that he is part of this and working with me on this for as long as we can see into the future. That's my personal hope anyway. So anyway, that's what I wanted to tell you about me. And I wanted to start with that. I said it was going to take about 20 minutes. It took 17. Yeah.
How did you become a Lutheran?
That was, and again, if you come to any of our new member classes, you will find a lot of people walk through these doors without the intention of becoming Lutheran who do become Lutheran. Anita is the one who drugged me here because she said they got some exciting things going on here, and we'd read about Hope Lutheran in the paper, and we'd seen things. We'd seen, you know, some things about House of Hope and just a lot of different things. And so she came and she said, I think you really would like this. And so I came, and this was after going to several other churches. I came here and immediately, walking in the door, you felt like it was different.
But also, when you left the Catholic faith,
Up, microphone.
well, we became Episcopalian. Just do that. Just talk about being Episcopalian. Just talk about, you just didn't jump into Lutheran from Catholic. We were
Okay, yeah.
Episcopalian.
I'll give a little background because I want to spend a lot of
Just a
time on
little
it. But
bit.
yeah,
2 seconds. 2 seconds.
when Anita and I got married, the Catholic Church is not real welcoming of those who has left it, especially priests. And so we could not find a church that would take us. We actually tried. We went to a friend of mine's church. The pastor was a friend of mine that I'd gone to school with. And I said, he'll be fine with us coming here. And he actually came up to us afterwards and said, I'd prefer you not come to my church, but if you do, if you'd sit in the last pew. So instead of just, you beat your head against the wall so many times, and then you find some place where you're welcome. So I found an Episcopal, actually a friend of mine who also left the priesthood, was active in an Episcopal church in Louisville, St. Matthew's Episcopal Church. And it was a socially active church. I mean, they believed in living their faith outside the four walls, which is what we wanted. And he said, I see you as somebody having a wealth of information and skills and training, and I'd welcome you in. And so I went there, and we went there for 30 years. And I was asked on 3 occasions to become a priest in the Episcopal Church, but at the time, I was very happy doing lay ministry. I was on the vestry, which is the equivalent of our council twice. I was on the call committee. I was in the choir, just did all these things, and it was good. The kids were growing up at home, and I was just getting into my teaching career, so it was good. But when we came here, I didn't intend to become Lutheran. But when I came here, I was so impressed with it that I told Anita, I said, we've got to go see that pastor up there, that Pastor Mark. We've got to go make an appointment with him. And we did, and we came in. I bet we were in there for 2.5, 3 hours. And he gave me a lot of materials to read. I went home and read it, and I realized that I'd been a Lutheran Catholic all along anyway. And I say that when Catholics come in to see me and talk about that, I say, I read it and I realize that's the kind of Catholic I was from the very beginning. I was the Catholic that hated the exclusions of the Catholic Church. I hated keeping people from the altar. I hated keeping married couples from the altar because of divorce and remarriage. All the things that cause great pain, I was finding some place that had wide open doors. And that was what I was feeling all along. So, all right, any other questions before we, yeah?
With all the, I'm a slave mathematics person. But with all the years you, with all the years you were telling us, I figure you're about 100 years old now.
I've packed a lot in my 30 years. A lot, yeah. I've lived a double life. Yeah, for the most part, I haven't let any moss grow. I've always been kind of moving, and it's good to be someplace and just kind of settle into it. All right, anything else before we go on? Okay, we're going to be doing then, and like I said, this is like the first night. So when you go to college, the first night, you kind of get introduced to the class. The professor gives you the syllabus, and I always love the first night of class because then you go home after that. Well, it's not going to be quite that simple, but we may have a shorter class tonight. But what I want to talk about tonight is why we would spend, because I am literally going to be spending these 3 weeks this month and 3 weeks in December, and then a lot of weeks come next semester, pretty much for the rest of the year, on the Apostle Paul. That is a lot of time to spend on one person. Now, I'm going to tell you in a few minutes why I think that we should be studying Paul. But I'd like to hear from you. I'd like to hear some things that... Peg, do you have anything to say? Cindy has the microphone back here, so anybody has anything to say or to ask or to throw into the pot. And you don't have to have anything. I'm just curious if anybody does. Sometimes the teacher says, what do you want to learn in this class? That's what I'm saying. And you may or may not learn it. I might say, well, that's good. Go somewhere else and you can learn that. But all right, David.
Yes. In regard to the Apostle Paul, he was very possessive personally for the gospel that was given to him. At times, almost, when he had the debate with Peter, and they ultimately went kind of two different ways. Peter back to the Jewish folks, and Paul called it his gospel. And I'm interested to see your take on that. I came from a very strong Pauline background that I don't necessarily hold, but
You're actually one of my inspirations, by the way. You'll see what I mean in a minute. But okay, thank you, David. Anything else? I just heard you have this love for Paul, and I thought maybe you might. No one's looking at you, though. Okay, anybody else? Because I don't want to show you the answers and then say, oh, that's what I was, again, that's the teacher in me. You notice you don't have a handout? I have handouts, but I didn't give it to you. Because if I gave it to you, you would read it. And I'm a teacher, and I know you don't give it to them ahead of time because then everyone's doing this, okay? You give it out at the proper time when you want to use it, okay? Again, that's the high school teacher in me. Not to say you are like high school students. I'm hoping that you're better than that, but. All right. So I said I do have handouts. You're welcome. And hopefully we'll be able to get the computer to work here. We've had interesting issues with it. I think this is a wifely duty. I mean, just in our case. Here, do you want to help?
He saves the first person in the rock.
Yep. Al, this screen up here isn't on. I know that one's on back there. I know. Did Peg tell you to say that? Okay. There's actually several sources that I am looking at. I meant to bring them up here with me. They're in my briefcase. But there's about 3 books that I've been reading for about the last 4 months on this. But the main book that I'm going to be using is this particular book right here. And so I just want to go ahead and give attribution to this Walter F. Taylor's the book, Paul, Apostle to the Nations. And that's actually the structure of the way I'm doing this, because that's the structure that he did. And so what I've done is I've worked within his structure, and I've looked at what his topics are, and then I've gone and I've read other things on that to try to bring that into it as well. I liked it because he had kind of all this background. And, for me, I'm not a Paul expert, but I had 2 courses in Pauline epistles that I absolutely loved, and I was blessed with having 2 wonderful professors who taught it, who got my imagination going. So I've always had a love of Paul. Just, how when you have somebody, I know this from math. There are some people who absolutely hate math, and they can usually trace that back to Mrs. or Mr. So-and-so that they had in the 4th grade. And yet I'll run into students who will say, I've always loved math. And then they can go back and they can say, well, I had so-and-so. So quite often the way you feel about something is based on who you first learned that from. But I've always had a great love for Paul, and a couple of things happened. So why do I want to devote all this time to the study of Paul the Apostle? Well, there were 3 separate conversations within the course of a month that all happened in different locations. They weren't at the same time, at the same place. One of them was from friends of ours who came to visit us from Louisville. The other one was with just a random person I was playing golf with, just someone who was put into our group and happened to be in my group. I had no idea who he was. And then there was a third person. So the first 2 people, when Rick and Sandy came to visit us, and they're very strong Christians who live in Louisville, Kentucky, and they came down to visit us, and they were talking to us about this strange phenomenon they saw starting to happen in their church. And they said, it says, 2 stay in their church's position that all the letters of Paul should be excluded from their lectionary and matters of faith in Jesus. So they said that what they were hearing from people who were joining their churches, there was way too much emphasis placed on Paul. That Paul had kind of hijacked the gospel, and you need to get back to Jesus. So the New Testament basically was the 4 Gospels. Okay, they may have looked at Revelation, I don't know, but basically the 4 Gospels. The works of Jesus, the things going on of Jesus. So I thought it was weird. I said, I've never heard of this at all before. So the 2 of them said that. Well, within a month, I'm playing golf, and how I got in this conversation with this guy in my group. I mean, I don't usually talk about Pauline theology when I'm getting ready to tee off the ball, but somehow we got on this conversation. Either they asked me where I worked, or I really can't remember, but they said, you know, I feel very strong about this, but people give Paul so much credit for everything, and I think we ought to just do away with Paul. And I'm like, oh my gosh, I just heard this 2 weeks ago. So I thought, if within the course of a month, I heard that kind of reaction to Paul, then there must be something going on out there. Has anyone else had any experiences with this? Okay, I mean, maybe that's a good thing. Maybe I'm the only one, right? But Anita, you were there when Rick and Sandy were talking about that. And again, I thought that seemed really weird. I said, well, I haven't read or heard anything about that. And again, maybe this guy on the golf course that day was just kind of, you know, off his rocker or something. I don't know, but... And then, one stating just the opposite. More emphasis on Paul and his letters than on the Gospels. So in other words, Paul becomes sort of the only authority what it means to be a Christian. Now, again, we're going to look at dates and all of that, and we're going to see why the letters of Paul are really important. But this is going too far the other way. Okay, we can go too far the other way and say that no, and I mean, we don't want to just read the letters of Paul and then call it quits. And let's stop reading the gospel, and let's stop talking about the life of Jesus or what Jesus has done, or even Jesus' saving work for us. Let's just talk about Paul. No, I think Paul wouldn't like that. You know, the same way that Martin Luther felt about people talking about him. You know, I don't think Paul would be happy about a religion that was focused on Paul, because that was not what Paul's intent would have ever been. So anyway, all this happened within the course of a month, and then there was a movie. Did anybody go see the movie Paul, Apostle of Christ over at Sumter Landing? It was about a year ago that it was there. The appearance of the movie Paul, Apostle of Christ at the box office. It played here at the Old Mill Playhouse, and we went to see it. This movie is taken mostly from the Acts of the Apostles. In fact, it's almost exclusively from the Acts of the Apostles. And for those of you who like, you know, literary devices, the literary device of this particular movie is Paul's at the end of his life, and he's in prison. And Luke has come to sort of aid him. And there's some humorous parts in the movie, you know, because Paul will say something like, you know, 1 Corinthians 13, his great chapter 13. And he's saying, you know, that's pretty good. Luke, why don't you write that down? You know, so there's some humor in that too, where Paul's saying, oh, I like the way that sounds. Be sure you write that down. So it's kind of seen that Luke is coming to aid Paul while he's in prison. But the other thing is Paul is flashing back. And a real critical part of the movie is he's flashing back to before his conversion and the way he treated people, and it's almost like it was haunting him. And I think that's really the first time I thought about that, that was probably a realistic thing for Paul, that he would have thought back to what he had actually done. And the faces of those people were very real to him, and he could see them in his mind. So anyway, that's the literary device of the way that movie was told. It's from the Acts of the Apostles, and we're going to talk, that's one of the things we're going to talk about later on, is the relationship of the letters of Paul to the Acts of the Apostles, because there's some things where they agree, things where they don't agree, and how are we going to fit them together. That's something that we will be talking about. So anyway, those are kind of the three things that were going on that I said, this seems like this is something that is deserving of a little bit of time. So I said, I think I will give it a little bit of time. Okay, so a note on terms, okay? And when we talk about these terms, we kind of use them interchangeably without even thinking about it. When we're looking at those books that are before Matthew in our Bible, we call them the Old Testament. Paul wouldn't have called them the Old Testament because there wasn't a New Testament for him to refer to at the time. So it wasn't like there was an old or a new. When I was a student at St. Meinrad, we had two gyms. There was the old gym and the new gym. The old gym was built in 1937, and the new gym was built in 1939. But they were still calling them the old gym and the new gym. So I suppose there was a time when that had meaning, but for those of us who were there in the 70s, that didn't, it was like the old gym and the older gym. So for Paul, there was no Old Testament. But what there was for Paul was Israel's Bible. Okay, sometimes you'll hear it as the Hebrew Scriptures, but he probably would have been reading it in Greek. So we won't usually be calling it the Old Testament. Now, if you call it the Old Testament, will you get a failing grade? No, if you listen to my sermon this past weekend, everyone here gets an A. Okay, you all get an A. I'll tell you that now so that you don't have to worry about it between now and the end of the semester. All right, so that's the first thing on terms. Secondly, typically when I talk about someone who lived at this time, we'll use the term Judean rather than Jew. Okay, and there's actually, lots of different reasons for that. First of all, a Judean refers to the place of the temple and the ceremonies, whereas a Jew refers to the law, and we also know that there's horrible connotations that go with Jew. Some of them not intended. John's gospel uses the word the Jews quite often, and it's been used, unfortunately, in very horrible ways, which would have never been the intent of the writer of John's gospel, but that indeed is what has happened. So these are, in a way, kind of interchangeable, but we will refer to people who lived in this period of the time, Israel, as Judeans. The next dyad here, nations versus Gentiles, is kind of a hard one to talk about. David made mention a little while ago about Paul's emphasis on the Gentiles, whereas Peter kind of went off in a different way. So there are times when Paul is referring to Gentiles, meaning those people that he did not want to see have to become a member of the house of Israel in order to become Christian. But then there's times when he's referring to nations as if it's the nations of the world. And usually it's the context you have to look at to see what it is. Okay? And the word that's used is usually the word ethne, and it can be translated either way, but it really, again, depends on the context of what's going on at that particular time. So what we're going to do as we look at it is we'll try to place it in context. And then lastly, Christ believer versus Christian. Is it positive or negative to be called a Christian? We would tend to think of it as being positive. If someone said, you're a good Christian person, I would take that as a compliment. At the time of Paul, if they called you a Christian, that was not a compliment. Okay, so being a Christian, in fact, the first word Christian actually wasn't used until Ignatius, Bishop of Antioch, used it between 110 and 117. But a Christ believer is what that group would have been. One other thing about that movie, for those of you who saw it, is I love the way it pictures what the early church looked like. We hear early church, and we think church, okay. Well, they probably didn't have a church this big, but maybe it was more like the size of Lake Weir, right? It wasn't even that, okay? So it wasn't anything that formalized, that consolidated, that structured. And I think that movie did a good job of showing that. These people sort of huddled together, trying to find a place where they could worship this Christ in such a way that they wouldn't be seized by anyone from the government. Yes?
I still don't understand why Christian is not as, it's not.
Well, the question has to do with why we wouldn't. The reason we're not going to use Christian is because it wouldn't be historically accurate for that particular time period. Okay, we could look further in history and it would make perfect sense to refer to people as Christians. But we're talking about a church yet that's still very, it's very organic and kind of changing, and families moving here and there, so you don't quite have a structure like you do. A little bit later on, then you would be able to use Christian with more historical accuracy. All right, Cindy's bringing your mic.
Bruce, would you say that the early church would still have been very much Jewish? They were just Jewish believers in the Christ. And, is it possible or is it true that actually the church began truly, what we know as the Judean church, the Jewish church, was becoming Christian, to those who knew Christ and believed? I know it didn't always remain, but...
Right. At this particular time, there was nothing wrong with being a good Jewish person and being a Christ believer. And you could reconcile those two very easily. Whereas we would look at Christian and say, are you Jewish or are you Christian? Now, in fact, we had dinner as part of a group last week with some Messianic Jews. So there are people who do, but for the most part, at this time, there's no real structure, no difference between them. And that's part of what Paul's going to have to deal with, because you're going to have more and more people who come in who are not of a Jewish background. But if you're a Christ believer as opposed to a Christian, then you don't get into the whole thing of whether you're Christian or Jewish. Yeah.
What about the way?
Well, the question is, what about the way? That's one of the names that was given to the early church, was the way. So again, that was the same thing. But notice we're not saying Christian. So not to say there's anything wrong with the word Christian, but we won't typically not use that in here because we're taking a later historical term and trying to push it back into a time in history when it would not have made sense. If you would have said to Paul, are you a Christian? He would have just scratched his head and said, what do you mean? I don't know what that means. But if you were to say, are you a Christ believer? He would say, absolutely, I'm a Christ believer. That is if you got him after the conversion and not before. But as with any major figure in history, there's always going to be positive and negative evaluations. So on this side, I'm going to look at the positive. And okay, get my glasses here so I can read. So let's start with Augustine, Bishop 354 to 430. And actually, I'm going to put Augustine and Martin Luther together, who's the next one. Okay? Not because they were the same time period. As you can see, they're not even close to the same time period. But first of all, before I even get into the positive and negative, anyone that we look at who is a historical figure, if I were to mention names like Barack Obama, Hillary Clinton, Donald Trump, we'd have people saying positive and negatives about any of them. They're historical figures, correct? So we think of those, and we think sometimes of polarizations. Paul can be just as polarizing, okay? Even though for us we think he's one of our heroes. How could that be possible? But there have been people on both sides of the fence on him. Oh, well, the other person I was going to mention was Lady Gaga. Both Augustine and Martin Luther, when it boils right down to it, they believed that Paul was at the very heart of the Christian enterprise. Okay? They really saw him at the very heart of it. It should be no surprise that Martin Luther would say that. right? We wouldn't be here if it wasn't his reading of the letters that Paul wrote. That's what led to his discovery about what it meant to be justified by faith alone. So that would have never happened. And so for him, of course, Paul is a very central figure. But all the way back to Augustine, who's one of the early church fathers, that would have been true. John Wesley, he's on the plus side. Wesley said that he found his heart strangely warmed by Luther's words about Paul. Notice it wasn't his words of Paul, it was reading Luther's words about Paul. See, so Wesley really depended on Luther for everything. Okay, next two. Let's put these two together. And these two are contemporaries of each other, Karl Barth and Rudolf Bultmann. Focusing on God's unmerited love for us, they concentrated on Paul's radical analysis of human nature and sin. So the radical nature, and both of those would have shared this particular view, the radical nature of human nature and sin. Now, let's look over on the other side. This is the negative side. Judeans during Paul's lifetime. Okay, Paul was seen as a threat by many Judeans, okay, because again, he's bringing a message that the Messiah that they're waiting for, well, guess what? That Messiah has come. And so there would be Judeans at that time who would have said that they couldn't believe what Paul was teaching, but even more importantly, Paul's wanting to relax the Jewish laws, you know, and that would have been something that for some Jewish people would have been anathema, just to even think about doing that. We'll be talking about that in a lot more detail later on. Paul de Lagarde and other 19th century scholars, they felt, and this kind of reminded me of those two comments I got, they felt that Paul burdened Christianity with Israel's Bible. They thought that Paul brought too much of what we would call the Old Testament in. Why didn't he just ignore all that and just concentrate on Christ? But you know, Paul in his writing does look at how have the scriptures been fulfilled. You know, what has happened in Israel's scriptures that were fulfilled in the person of Jesus. Some of these scholars said we shouldn't even look at the Israel Bible. We should just look at the New Testament, and Paul just spends too much time going back and looking at that. Friedrich Nietzsche. Wasn't much of anything this guy liked, really. He, as if this wasn't the pot calling the kettle black, he felt that Paul was a negative evangelist, a proclaimer of bad news. I think he's just kind of looking through his own lens there, maybe. Although Nietzsche is great to read, though. George Bernard Shaw. In 1913, I don't know if you're aware of this, in the prelude to Androcles and the Lion, he called Paul, quote, the monstrous imposition upon Jesus. The monstrous imposition upon Jesus. So again, this kind of goes back to those two comments I initially mentioned. You know, people who saw that Paul's kind of burdened the message of Jesus. If we just go directly to the message of Jesus and sort of strip away Paul, we would get to it a little bit easier. So that's what some of these people on this side are going to look at. Which outburst? He felt that way, but he just expressed it. That was one time when he expressed it, but he really did feel that Paul was a burden on the message of Jesus. So, but that was one place where he put it in writing, and it's an odd place, I think, you know, kind of an odd place in an odd play. And then opponents of slavery in the American South, and we're actually going to be using Paul's use of slaves. And that's one of the things we're going to use as we start looking at some of the literary techniques and the way to study Paul. Because opponents of slavery looked at Paul as if he was a proponent of slavery. Okay? But again, there's a lot of people, you could look at it and say, you know, that Paul was a proponent of wives being submissive to their husbands. I mean, there's all kinds of things that we can take a line or two from Paul and we can blow it up to get a full worldview that is perhaps not a fair representation of Paul. Yeah, Becky.
George Washington had slaves.
Did he really? And he's the father of our country. I know.
It was a custom, a way of life at the time.
The comment is being made about George Washington and Thomas Jefferson having slaves. Absolutely. Now, would they have slaves today? We would certainly hope not, because you're a product of your time and your place and things that are going on. And I'd say if you're before 1865, that's a very likely thing that would happen. And again, how would that be seen by anybody, including Christians? I mean, that would not have been seen as anything that was wrong because of the time that you live in. And again, that's one of the things we're going to look at Paul, because we want to be sure that we firmly place Paul in the time that he lives. And that's going to be one of our things we're going to look at in a lot of detail over the coming weeks, to be sure that we're not bringing our current mindset into what Paul's doing. So again, we could look at someone who is a father of our country and say, wow, they had slaves. They did. And by current standards, that would be somebody that, there'd probably be some tweets about that. But
well, if in George Washington's day, that was a way of taking care of those people. The bad part of it was we didn't give them a choice.
yeah. Well, and again, it's a very ingrained system. It involved economics and all kinds of other things as well. So it's not as simple as we tend to want to make it. Absolutely. Paul's thought was and remains seminal. It is critical to look at. You cannot escape it. Love it, hate it, you can't escape it. You have to look at what Paul has to say for all kinds of reasons. We're going to look at it because of dating of things, because of what he went through, the way he wrote things, what we owe to him now about things that we say and we do that are part of what we have. He is a seminal thinker, has always been and will be. And so we need to study that. It makes us better to know it. He was the first theological author of early Christianity. Now, again, remember, it's not Christianity at this time. Early Christianity, it's really the early Christ believers. But he's the first one to actually sit down and write theology. Okay, he wrote before the Gospels, so he is the first one to actually write this stuff down and to try to give it some kind of a theological framework. And that's going to be important as we look at it, to remember that he is also a theologian as he writes. Of the 27 documents in the New Testament, 13 claim to be by Paul. We'll be narrowing that down, by the way, a little bit later on. But at least for right now, we're going to say the 13. And by the way, that goes up to 14 if you include Hebrews, which, many would have considered to be. So that is half or just over half actually have Pauline kind of authorship on it. I found this photograph of Paul, and I thought it was a great likeness. So, this is the one that David mentioned earlier too. By arguing that Gentiles could become part of the community of believers without first becoming Judean converts. Otherwise, we would have all taken a different path to Christianity than what we took. So he was the one who had to address that question. And we'll talk about that because, again, we just look at it and say, wasn't that great? At the time, it was earth-shattering. I mean, it would have been, again, if Twitter was around back then, I just can't imagine what would have been tweeted about some of the things that Paul was actually trying to do. Paul's apocalyptic terms. It's going to become clear later on when we talk about it that Paul thought the end was like right around the corner. Okay, we're going to find out later on that because, of the belief in the resurrection, if Jesus was raised from the dead, that means resurrection has started, so that means the end times are here. And they're coming like any day now. So maybe you better leave your wives and your husbands. Maybe you better just go ahead and start getting ready because it's going to come any time. Are there still those kinds of terms around? I mean, absolutely. You just look at a lot of the literature and the movies, and they don't call it apocalyptic anymore, but I mean, there's still those kinds of terms and those kinds of end times things they're still around just as much now as they would have been at the time of Paul. But in a way that makes him almost sound contemporary, because there's contemporary kinds of things like that. And again, for 20 centuries, Paul has been one of the premier Christian theologians. While the microphone's coming up to her, let me say, in all churches, I mean, his letters are still being read. They're being read all over the place.
Well, we need to remember that Paul was a highly educated person.
And we're going to talk about that, yes.
The apostles were fishermen and shepherds and things like that. They were not educated. So mainly a lot of the New Testament is because Paul wrote, and the apostles did not. And that would be why he had a lot of influence.
He did. And we're going to talk about why such an educated man like him would have become a tent maker, which is sort of the equivalent of becoming a fisherman. So that's an interesting question that we'll be looking at a little bit later on. But yes, he did. He had the education, and that's part of when we look at his letters and we start looking at the influences on his life, we'll see that he wasn't just your ordinary person. Ordinary people didn't write this way, so he had some educational background. But my main thing here on this last bullet right here is that, I mean, wouldn't it be wonderful if we could just get a ping somewhere for everywhere on a Sunday a letter of Paul's being read, to see how many hundreds of thousands of occasions, just on one Sunday, a letter of Paul's being read somewhere in the world in some language. And I mean, that could probably be true of the Gospels as well, all right? But there aren't too many other things that we could say would be being read with that kind of regularity as those would be. And that's been true for 20 centuries. Okay, so the format in the series here, what I'm going to be doing, my primary goal here is to introduce you to the life, the struggles, the letters, and the thought of this first century person, Paul, and everything that means. So we're going to look at what it meant to live in the first century, what kinds of things were going on, what kind of world would Paul have been in, what would the places where he had gone to been like, everything from religious backgrounds to cultural backgrounds. We're going to look at the letters and talk about how you can study the letters, what kinds of tools could you use, everything from literary criticism that you could use for any kind of text, to theological criticism. So we're going to be looking at all these things in a lot of detail. During part one, we're going to cover the following questions. Next week, how can we study Paul? Okay, so today is October the 9th. That's October the 16th. Okay, how can we study Paul? And so we're going to look at all the different ways that you could be studying Paul. We're going to skip the week after, October the 23rd. And the last week of October, we're going to look at what sources can we use to study Paul. Okay, so that we can kind of build a library of what kinds of things we could look at and still be faithful to who Paul is without trying to go off on something that's not going to make any sense. When December comes around, we're going to start by looking where and when did Paul live and work. Our second session in December is going to look at what kind of person was Paul. And then our last one that we're going to look at is what did Paul do? Well, we know he wrote letters, but besides writing letters, what else did Paul do? Really kind of fascinating. When you put all the pieces together, there's so many things that are in there. So those are the topics. Part two will begin after the Christmas holidays. In part two, that's when we're going to look at individual letters. And I have here that we're not going to just talk about the letters, but you're going to be given a chance to read it. So we'll talk about what the letter is, give you a chance to read it ahead of time before we come. If you haven't read it, there's not going to be a pop quiz. I'm not going to do to you what I did to my classes and say, okay, just to be sure everybody read it. Okay? I want you to quote the third verse of the third chapter. No, won't do anything like that. But like with anything, like what I would say to my students whenever we would cover something, I'd say it's going to help you if you read this before we cover it. If you choose not to read it, that's fine. You'll still get something out of it. But if you've read it ahead of time, then you will get even more out of it. So I'm going to encourage that you read the letter that we're going to be talking about ahead of time. And as I said, we'll probably be looking at 2-week segments. So you won't be reading a new letter once a week. You'll be reading a letter, and it will be discussed for 2 weeks, once by myself and then by Pastor Ronnie, and then we'll go on to another letter. You're going to be given a chance to read a letter, and we will look at each one within the cultures and society of which Paul and the letter's recipients were part of. Also in part 2, with each letter we examine, our detailed look will serve as a case study for selected Pauline themes. I hope that by the time we get to the end of the year and we've gone through all of these themes, you'll have like all of these hooks where you can hang things on as we look through the letter. So you'll be able to say, oh, this is where Paul is sounding particularly Greek, or here's an example of his education. So there's going to be a lot of things. You'll have a lot of tools in your toolbox that when you read a letter, you won't just be reading it as if you're hearing it for the first time. Or if you're just sitting in there on Sunday and you hear it, you read it, and we tend to think of it in 21st century terms. We're thinking about what it sounds like to us today. What I'd like for you to be able to do is to read it in a way that you have a critical approach to it, and you can think, first, what did this mean when it was originally written, and now what does that mean for us today? Because they all still mean a lot for us today, even when they're put in the historical context. Thus, Paul's theology will come from the writings rather than being imposed on the writings. So in other words, rather us saying, this is what Paul's trying to say, you read the writings, and from that you say, oh, look, it looks like this is what Paul is trying to say. Okay, I could give you the answers to the test, but it's a lot easier if we read it together and then pull the answers out together. And then each topic is going to conclude with class questions, okay? And these are questions, and what I'm going to do is I'm going to put the questions at the beginning of the topic and again at the end, so that you'll see what the questions are at the beginning, so that this is something I found easier to do with students. That way you're kind of thinking of them as you're hearing material or as people are asking questions, and then when we get to the end, you have more to say about it, rather than at the end, all of a sudden there are the questions. And you say, oh, gee, we talked about this in the first 10 minutes. I don't know what. So if you see what the questions are ahead of time, that kind of helps. What do you think this is going to say? So do you have any questions? Okay, we got to bring the microphone up. I saw Marilyn's hand there first.
I have a couple of things. How long did Paul live? Do you have any idea? How old was he when he died?
Let's see, what? I want to say it was, I do know, I can't remember right now though. I want to say it's around 60, look it up on your phone there real fast.
Okay, my second
He
question.
wrote in the 50s, late 40s, early 50s.
My second question then is, okay, for all those years, a lot of people must have gotten to know him and know about him. Mm-hmm. Were there people then who didn't go along with what he said?
Well, absolutely. You know, and imagine him coming to your community, and you've gotten word of this guy who's been killing Christ believers all over the place, and now suddenly he's coming to visit you. I mean, you might hide the china, you know? I mean, it's a little nervous. So absolutely, there would have been people.
Were there people then
Early 60s. He died in the early 60s.
Were there people then who were also writing, and maybe writing things that didn't necessarily agree with everything Paul was writing? What I mean is, was there competition between theologians at that time?
Well, there weren't a lot of theologians, but there was a lot of writing going on, absolutely. And we're going to look at some of the other writings, in fact. You know, if you look in our scriptures, somebody throughout history has chosen what goes in and what goes out. There's a lot, if you look at what's not in there, that's a lot more volumes than what's in there. So, and we'll look at some of those things because it can give you some information. I mean, you have to take it with a grain of salt because we have to say, okay, somebody somewhere way back then decided this shouldn't be in the canon. So maybe there's a reason this shouldn't be in the canon. But, you know, they said that Paul always wore plaid pants. Okay? So can we take that with, you know, historical accuracy? This was written We know it was written around that time, but it's not in our canon. So we're going to talk about that. How much weight do we give that? You know, the fact that it wasn't included in our canon is going to be important for us. Now, if it's a non-Christian document, that's extremely important, because if it's a historian saying, well, Paul wore plaid pants, we'd say, there it is. We now know Paul wore plaid pants because Josephus said this, who was a great historian. So good questions. Yeah, Peg.
I'm particularly confused about the term, something you said a moment ago.
Okay.
That Paul was sounding particularly Greek. Now, that word is used a lot in the New Testament, but they don't necessarily mean he was from Greece.
Right.
What does it mean?
We're going to take a long look at that, because just like the Roman Empire made the whole world Roman, so the Greek Empire made the whole world Greek. So the Greek influence was very, very strong, and that would have been very strong for Paul. Okay, he would have probably read and written in Greek, for example. So
you mean philosophy?
Philosophy, yeah.
Okay.
Yeah, it actually, when we look at the first century, I mean, I'm so intrigued by it. It sounds so exciting. It sounds like there's so many things going on, so much diversity of thought, that I think in many ways it could have been a real exciting time to live, because, you know, there were multiple religions around and philosophies, and you had both the Greek and the Roman influence, and I mean, those are the two great influences of the whole world, and both of them kind of at the same time. Kind of neat. So when I read this stuff, it sort of gets my creative or imaginative juices flowing. Yes, sir.
Yeah, do you think that Paul, was Paul, you know, so much of his writing was actually personal, addressing a specific problem in a specific place. And I wonder if we take it too much as everything that Paul wrote was so directly from God as a doctrine. You know, when there's two women fighting, you know, do we overemphasize that maybe?
And that's part of what we're going to look at, because he did write to specific churches and specific locations with specific problems. So, you know, you can think about our congregation. If Paul was writing to us today, what would he be saying? And then could we take that and expand it to every other church and say they're all having the same problem in the same way? Again, very interesting question. But we will look at that, the fact that this is a church, and this is the situation of what that church was in that location. Now, remember, when I'm saying church, I'm talking about probably a household. I'm talking about people gathering under the roof of someone's house, not something with a steeple, you know, and church bells ringing. But when we look at what's going on there, and Paul is obviously trying to address that church, then we're going to say, how much of that can we just apply across the board to everybody? But even if he's addressing one congregation with a problem, his thoughts are still part of that. So perhaps we can sort of extrapolate from that and say, well, this seems to be the way to handle this from a wise perspective. Maybe this similar situation over here, Paul would see it the same way. Maybe, maybe not. So that's part of what we'll be looking at. Great questions. Any other questions? Cindy got to run all the way to the back.
That's okay.
We're giving her lots of exercise here.
Thank you. I'm reminded of a discussion that Pastor Piper and I had and some others maybe a year ago about Paul. Pastor Piper said, you know, I only had a year to get a church off the ground, and it seemed that Paul was converted shortly after Christ's death and then didn't show up again for 10, 11 years. What did he do during that period of time? What did Paul do? Do we know?
Well,
or am I incorrect and he was missing all those stuff?
His letters, again, dating some of his letters is tricky, so we can't say with any certainty that there was a long period of time in there, but I'm sure there was a period of time there where he was rather confused, to say the least, at his life's work. And remember, he was a Judean, and he was a Pharisee. We're going to look at that and talk about what that means, with very strict beliefs. And now all of a sudden he's learned in this experience, whatever it was, that everything he had believed is not correct. So I'm sure there's some self-examination that's going on. But remember, the glimpse we're getting into Paul is letters. So we don't know if there could have been something else going on before letters were written. He may have decided after a period of time, what I'm doing isn't working, I need to write letters. This is a better way of doing it. So just because there's silence for a period of time, we can't say that Paul was, watching TV. Paul could have very well been very active doing some things and just, it doesn't show up. And we'll look at Acts, because Acts has some things in there too, and we'll look at, again, how much reliance we can give on what Acts says.
He spent some time with Peter too, didn't he?
Absolutely, and again, we'll look at that. How many times did he go to Jerusalem? How long did he spend with Peter? His letters versus what Acts says. Yeah, but there was time. He absolutely did go to Jerusalem and meet with the apostles, and so that is in there as well. Okay, any other questions? Okay, it is almost 10 after. What I was going to do at the end, if there was time, is I was going to show you some of the extras from the movie, but I mean, I can do it, or I can say, I have about 20 minutes worth of extras. We have 20 minutes, so okay. If you want to, we don't have time to watch the whole movie, but there are some interesting things, and when you go see the movie, you don't get to see the extra scenes, but they put them on the DVD. So I was looking at some of the extra scenes. Now, that's our idea, but whether this thing is going to cooperate or not, that's another story. So, and by the way, we have to turn off Al the live stream on this. So for those of you who do watch this at home